Welcome to Headlines. This is David Lichtenstein here in the Yeshiva Shalmaila. This week we have an interesting program, a little bit away from halacha. We had halacha a few weeks. We're going to have Ben Shapiro, the famous conservative commentator. He's unique in the respect that he wears a yarmulke on national TV all the time. He's Orthodox. And we're going to be asking him many questions. You know, you're in love with Trump. Well, is Trump really... Trump is somebody who tramples on all the Aseres HaDibros. Should he be a dugmada, a model for Klal Yisrael, for the Jews in America? Why do you wear a yarmulke in public? Are you worried? He antagonizes a lot of people. Is he concerned that maybe he could create anti-Semitism? And as somebody who's really out there in the world and is probably the most public Orthodox person in the political arena, is there a new face to anti-Semitism today? When the Sari Shel Yosef says, Lama Zatishal Shmi, he's telling him that I have no name. Anti-Semitism keeps morphing. Is maybe the ADL outdated? Who is the Antiochus of our generation? We'll be speaking to him about this. And following that, we will have Rabbi Yehoshua Pfeffer. Will be speaking to Rabbi Meir. He's the head of the Business Ethics Center of Yerushalayim. He's an author, a very famous author, a famous ethicist. So this should be a very interesting program. Before we begin, I do want to say a small vart on it's not really the parsha anymore, but it's more about Yosef. So Yosef marries the daughter of Potiphera, Sris Paroi Koyin Oin. Now, I'm sure you all remember that while working for his most auspicious job at Potiphera, it says, Vatisha Eishes Adainav, she lifted her eyes, she saw Yosef. Yosef was Yefei Torah V'Fasmara, and she said, Shichva Imi. What happens afterwards? He refuses to. So Vatitfaseu Bebigdav, and what does she say? You brought a Nar Ivri L'Tzachek Banu, to make fun. She gets him framed. He goes to jail for 2 years. He survives, and he becomes the melech. Now, of all the people to marry, I mean, okay, some Medrash says Dinah was the daughter. It's Medrash Mechilik. Regardless, I mean, I ask you, he spent half of Yom Tovim in her house. It couldn't have been all that comfortable. I mean, he may have had a reason to do it, but how did he live with it? I mean, what was Thanksgiving dinner like at the home of Potiphera when Yosef attended? And how did Yosef's wife, interestingly, understand all of this? I didn't see anybody really ask this. Let me suggest something interesting, and I think relevant. Yosef is the most successful person, right, worldly person in the Torah, arguably. Right? He becomes the Melech of Mitzrayim, basically, or not the Melech, but Avrech in Mitzrayim. How did he do it? And we know more than that. We know that Yosef, amazingly, was able to keep a good spirits in every situation. And let me give you an example. After he's sold by his brothers, right? He goes to the house of Potiphera. He's framed. These are things that, think of a triple deluxe. He's sold by his brothers, framed. He ends up in the dungeon, right? What does he do in the dungeon? He tells the Sarah Mashkim and the Sarah from Lama Naflu Panecha. I see your mood today is not as good as it was yesterday. Now imagine somebody who's been framed, sold by his brothers, he's in jail. This person would be pounding the sand with bitterness. Imagine what they did to me, right? They stole me, Ganav Ganafti. And Yosef is in such he maintains his equanimity. He's able to see, I see your mood changed a little bit from yesterday. Lama naflu panecha. So we see he's able to keep a wonderful mood. How is Yosef able to do that? How could he be so present, not caught up in the grief of the past? So let me give you a thought. He names his first son Menashe and his second son Ephraim. Ki nashani, the Rebbeinu Shalom allowed me to forget all the grief of what happened to me growing up. And Ephraim is Ephraim, because I was fruitful and multiplied in the new land. I was very successful. Paris, right? I made Paris. Why didn't he name the first child Ephraim and the second kid Menashe? She should name Ephraim, the good stuff, and Nashani, the bad stuff. So I put to you that the answer would be that Yosef is telling us, if you want to be fruitful, if you want to be productive, if you want to build relationships, you want to be matzliach, you need Nashani before Hifrani. You have to let go of the past, let go of the anger, let go of the aggravation, let go of the defeats, let go of the dagmas nefesh. If you could let go of that and you could be present, then you could focus on Hifrani. You could focus on success. A person who's living in the past, what this one did to me, what that one, I could have done this, I should have, I would have, etc. You ever see an angry person who's productive? They get eaten up by their anger. So Yosef teaches us the most productive person says Nashani comes before Hifrani. Let go. You can't run a race if you're carrying a big bag of bricks in your knapsack. And where does Yosef get this idea from? His mother, the name Yosef. Vatikra Shma Yosef Leimar. Osaf Elokim es Charpasi. The Rebbeinu Shalom hat weggewischt. He cleaned up my embarrassment, my humiliation. Yosef li ben Acher. And let me have another child. I got rid of the past. You know what that means? Then I can move forward. Right? Successful. Yosef is teaching us the secret to being present, to grasping the moment, to living now, is not to let yesterday steal today. Asaf Yosef, Nashani Hifrani. So I put to you, Yosef put that to the test in the most extreme manner. By him marrying the daughter of Potiphera, you know what he said? I have the ability to move past, to forgive anybody. He made it a lamaisa. Every time he went Yom Tiftir, you know what he was saying? He's saying forgiveness by me is not lip service. It's real forgiveness. And why do I think this is an important word? Because except for you, I know I'm talking to you, you don't have anybody to forgive. You may have nothing to forget. You have no aggravation in the past that keeps you up at night, that you look at somebody or something and you grit your teeth. But I do, and I think maybe some of us others do as well. And so if we want to be more successful and we want to be makabel on ourselves, midas Yosef, and we want to be zeicha to Yosef and to Efrani, before that we have to remember, first comes Nashani and first comes Asaf. So here's the riddle for this week. End of the parsha in Perek Nun, Pasuk Gimel. Vayimlu loy arboim yoin, ki kein yimlu yemei hachanutim. That 40 days they waited for them to do whatever, the besamim, the incense, the wrapping, whatever they do to mummify Yaakov Avinu. The question is, it says there's a lav of loy sulin. Kfura has to be the same day if possible. How did he allow it to be 40 days? That's question number one. And the second question is, he said, when Yaakov saw that the Shechina went away from him, he said, what does Rashi say about Ephraim and Menashe? He showed that these are my kids with a star and a ksuba. So the question is, and the yeshiva boy would ask this question, everybody knows that by a dava sher be'erva, you need 2 edim. If you makadosh b'lo edim, it's nothing. A ksuba b'lo edim is also nothing. So the question is, which edim did Yosef possibly have in Mitzrayim that he should say Bonayhem, right? And he should show them Shtar Eris and Shtar Ksuba. It was just a self-written Shtar Eris and Shtar Ksuba, had no legal status, no halachic status. These are the 2 riddles of the week. At the end of the program, we will have the winners of last week's riddle. Let's go to our guests. We have the honor of having with us on the phone, I believe perhaps the most prominent person to actually, exhibit his orthodoxy, to wear his yarmulke wherever he goes. It's an honor to have you with us. Welcome, Ben.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So, Ben, the story of Hanukkah is an eternal story, and light and darkness change continually, depending on the period of time. If you were to look at the world today from an Orthodox Jew's point of view and say, or a Jew's point of view and say, who's the Antiochus? Who are the Maccabees? Who are the Misyavnim? Like, where do you see darkness and light taking the sort of the story of Hanukkah, looking at it through the prism of an Orthodox Jew today?
Well, I mean, I think that when it comes to who's Antiochus, I would say that it really comes in three forms, and they're movements that are broader than singular figures because we don't live in an age of empires per se. The three forms that I'd see Antiochus in are the anti-Semitism of the radical Islamic world. So this would be Iran, the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, Hezbollah. The anti-Semitism of the radical left, which enables that anti-Semitism by essentially suggesting that it is just part of an intersectional coalition, that the Jews are uniquely successful on the world stage and therefore cannot be victims of anti-Semitism, that the state of Israel is a state that victimizes and is not, in fact, victimized, that the state of Israel ought to be the repository for all Western angst about multiculturalism. And then finally, the right-wing anti-Semitism that you see from some ethno-nationalist groups in Europe and some white supremacist groups in the United States. The threat there seems to me a lot less threatening globally. It's certainly very threatening in specific places, as we saw in Pittsburgh, but the threat globally seems to me much more aligned with the radical left anti-Semitism and the radical Islamic anti-Semitism that seems to have made common cause in targeting the state of Israel and Jews inside Europe as well, directly in the case of radical Islamic anti-Semitism in Europe, and by proxy in the case of socialist and left anti-Semitism in Europe that enabled the radical Islamic anti-Semitism in Europe. As far as who the Maccabees are...
Let me interrupt. Ben, let me interrupt.
Sorry,
so would you say that, based upon what you're saying, organizations like the ADL, who are fighting the skinheads, aren't they fighting yesterday's anti-Semitism to a certain extent? Haven't they not realized, when Yaakov asks the angel his name, he says, Lama Zetishal Shmi. So the commentators say, you want to know the name, the face of anti-Semitism? I can't give you a name. It's constantly changing. You have to be on your toes. Is the ADL fighting? Is it an anachronism? Is it fighting yesterday's anti-Semitism?
Well, I think the ADL, because it is a left-leaning organization and sees the threat of anti-Semitism as right-wing anti-Semitism, it's not that what they're fighting doesn't exist. Is they are fighting an anti-Semitism that is significantly less threatening to Jews on the world stage and even in the United States than anti-Semitism of the radical left and the multicultural left and the radical Islamic left. I mean, the radical Islamic anti-Semitic movement. That is much more damaging to Jews. There's no question that that's the case statistically. And again, this is not to make light of white supremacist anti-Semitism, which victimizes Jews on a not infrequent basis throughout the world, and particularly in the United States. But if you're talking about global threats to the Jews, I don't think that you can place the white supremacists who shoot up synagogues in the United States on the same plane as the Iranian regime that wants to wipe Israel off the face of the map, or the radical Islamists in Europe who have made countries fully unlivable for Jews to the point that thousands of them are leaving every year for Israel.
And who are the Maccabees today?
I've always thought that that's the one part of the story that doesn't change. The folks who are willing to fight for the continuity of the Jewish people and of the Jewish religion and aren't willing to make compromises in their belief in order to maintain the survival of their people. Those are the Maccabees. Again, the story of Hanukkah is the story of a civil war, and the civil war inside Judaism has been ever present. It's always continuing. There are a lot of Jews who don't hold to any real form of Judaism. They hold to a cultural Judaism that allows them to proclaim minority status without any of the actual belief systems or sacrifices that are inherent in a Torah-based Judaism. That's not authentic. That's basically leftism masquerading as Judaism, and I don't see, and I don't see that as part of the Maccabee movement. In terms of Israel, I think that the future of the state of Israel, I've always felt this, lies very strongly with the religious Zionist movement and with people who both believe in the existence of the state of Israel and the future of the state of Israel and fighting for the state of Israel, and also believe in the biblical basis of the state of Israel. Because if you don't believe in the biblical basis of the state of Israel and its necessity for existence, it's going to be very difficult to motivate folks to continue fighting every day on the front lines over there. And that's said with respect to a lot of secular Jews who are in the military in Israel and still believe in the existence of the state. But you do need a strong philosophical grounding in why you believe a state should exist. And I believe the same thing is true in the United States for folks who believe in the future of the United States. You need a strong philosophical grounding in why state is special and has a right to exist.
And who are the Misyavnim today? The Misyavnim were the Hellenized Jews who sort of converted to the Yevanim, etc. Who would you say, who's the protagonist? Who plays that role today?
Well, I mean, as I've said, I mean, I think that the Misyavnim never change. And it's always the same group of secularized Jews who believe that they can abandon core tenets of Judaism, still maintain a cultural Judaism, and then masquerade as representatives of authentic Judaism. You see a lot of groups like J Street who come to mind. But they're, again, an enormous number of secular Jews who seem to only care about Judaism when Jews are victimized at a Pittsburgh temple, but don't care about Judaism when Jews are slaughtered in the streets of Jerusalem, or when 300 rockets a day are falling on innocent Jews in Israel, or when Jews are being slaughtered in France or in Sweden. Then they don't care. Then anti-Semitism is only a matter of concern when it can be used as a club against politically right-wing foes in the United States or in Europe. It's never a real concern because in the end the identity is beyond the Judaic bounds. There was an op-ed in the New York Times by a secular Jew specifically talking about why he was uncomfortable celebrating Hanukkah because he considered himself one of the Yavnim. And I thought, this is exactly right. I mean, at least this person is being intellectually honest.
So do you see in the United States an increase in anti-Semitism, in particular under certain aspects of this administration, which seems to appeal to a more right-wing demographic, etc.? Has that caused, in your eyes, an increase in anti-Semitism or not?
So it depends on a couple of questions. First of all, I don't see a radical increase in violence against Jews. I think the statistics that have been cited are largely based on increased reporting and have been widely debunked. With that said, as the number one recipient of anti-Semitism on the internet in 2016, I can say that there was an alt-right white supremacist base that felt that President Trump was winking and nodding at them during the 2016 election and felt emboldened to express anti-Semitic viewpoints in a way that I certainly had not seen before in my career. But again, I think that the real anti-Semitism that folks ought to worry about is the polarization around anti-Semitism by the political left. I mean, the political left has decided they're full-scale going to ignore anti-Semitism. Since the 2016 election, I don't see any evidence that the Trump administration has acted in anti-Semitic fashion. I don't see any evidence that they have ignored anti-Semitism. I don't see any evidence that they have been consciously emboldening anti-Semitism. I think that the sort of winking and nodding at the alt-right that went on in 2016 and part of 2017, I think that was ugly, but I don't know if that was specifically anti-Semitic in origin or just President Trump has an unfortunate tendency to sort of pat people on the back who treat him well publicly, no matter how bad those people are. As far as the real threat of anti-Semitism, let's face this. I mean, the reality is that the rise in anti-Semitism in America's major cities is not being driven by the political right. It's being driven by the multicultural left. The New York Times admitted it as much. The New York Times had an article a few weeks back in which it talked about the number of anti-Semitic incidents that happened in New York City, and Jews walking down the street being punched by folks, being attacked, graffiti incidents at synagogues. And they couldn't tie a single one of those incidents to a white supremacist or right-wing group, and so they simply didn't report it. And the New York Times openly acknowledged they didn't report it because it didn't allow them to draw a specific line to President Trump and the right wing. The fact is that you have mainstream members of the Democratic Party who not only associate with Louis Farrakhan, they uphold Louis Farrakhan. Mainstream members of the Democratic Party, leaders in the new Democratic Party, who call for the anti-Semitic boycotts of sanctions movement against Israel to be successful. And you see the leadership of the Democratic Party kowtowing to this. I mean, Chuck Schumer, supposedly pro-Jewish Chuck Schumer, pro-Israel Chuck Schumer, was a fan of Keith Ellison for the head of DNC like a year and a half ago. So I'm much more worried about the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism inside of one of the political parties than the fringe elements of anti-Semitism that tend to hang around on the outskirts of the Republican Party.
Now, what has the effect been on, quote-unquote scandals, unsavory practices that, they find when a Jew is involved in a scandal, the New York Times, it licks its chops, it relishes it, it puts it out there. Do you find that these scandals have an effect on anti-Semitism? Is it overrated, et cetera?
Well, I mean, I think that anti-Semites rarely need an excuse to be angry at Jews. I think that it's a little bit exaggerated when folks, in my opinion, suggest, well, there's a Bernie Madoff scandal, this was bad for the Jews, or there's a Harvey Weinstein scandal that's bad for the Jews. The same folks who attribute Harvey Weinstein to the Jews would be attributing everything bad to the Jews in any case. I don't see a lot of people who are convinced of Jewish power by Harvey Weinstein who weren't already convinced of Jewish power. I think that the rule about Jews is the same rule that most people should hold in their everyday lives about most things, which is most people are not spending a lot of time thinking about you or us collectively or Jews in general, unless they're already thinking about Jews in general, in which case there's a good shot they're an anti-Semite in the first place. So I'm not. And this is why I've never really held by the idea that if the Jews sort of recede to the political background, if they become less prominent, then suddenly people will care less about them. I think that God has designed a world in which people tend to care in outsized fashion about the fate of the Jews, for good and for ill.
But when you have gentlemen like Alan Dershowitz defending Jeffrey Epstein while being an outspoken advocate for Israel, or have red line names like Ben Brafman support defending Harvey Weinstein, do you think does any damage to the to the movement to protect Israel when Alan Dershowitz's largest supporter is also at the same time defending Jeffrey Epstein?
So yes, just because Dershowitz is such a prominent defender of Israel. So anytime you have a defender of a particular principle who goes down over a scandal, it's damaging to that movement. But I don't think that is per se connected to the Jewishness of Alan Dershowitz. I don't think it's like, well, Alan Dershowitz is defending Jeffrey Epstein because he's Jewish and he's defending Israel because he's Jewish. I don't think it's that. I think it's a guy who is a strong defender of Israel is getting correctly raked over the coals for his association with Jeffrey Epstein. The same people who would attribute, the Epstein relationship to Jewishness, those are the folks who I think would be anti-Semitic in any case.
Do you think that it's irresponsible for people like Alan Dershowitz to be defending people like Epstein or Brafman?
Yeah, but I think that Alan Dershowitz has defended a lot of bad people in his career. So,
well, do you see a moral issue with that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, and I've said so widely in the past. I think that defending people who you believe are guilty of terrible crimes certainly presents a serious moral quandary. Now, I'm not sure that, again, I'm not a halachist, but I don't think that, would it be something that I would do? Would I feel comfortable defending somebody who I think was a murderer? No, I typically would not, even if I could justify that by saying, well, the system requires that this person have a lawyer. Right, but the system doesn't require that you do everything in your power to shade the truth so that the person gets off. Like, that's not something that is required.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Now, you wear a yarmulke. Tell me a little bit about it. Is it at times you either regretted it? Were you fearful of it? It's very common for, people who wear yarmulkes, but when they go into a particular meeting where they fear anti-Semitism, or they feel some type of a negative inflection to take it off, yet you quite courageously wear a yarmulke. Give me some of your thoughts about that.
I mean, the truth is that people ask me about it a lot, and I've never really thought about it too much because it's just something that I do. I mean, it's like waking up in the morning and putting on pants. Like, it's not something I've spent a lot of time thinking about. I've been wearing a yarmulke since I was 11 years old, and my family's Baal Tshuva. So when I went to middle school and started wearing a yarmulke in middle school, I just never took it off because this was who I am. This is my way of life, and why should I change that based on which audience I'm going to be speaking to? If somebody has a problem with that, they can stick it. So it's never really occurred to me to take off the yarmulke. It does what it's supposed to do, right? I mean, it's a reminder to me that my behavior is on display, and I haven't, like everyone else, I haven't always lived up to my own best standards for behavior, but I think that's the purpose of having a constant reminder so that you know when you're not and you try and fix it.
So look, let's face it, you've taken a strong conservative political position, which many people agree with, but since it's political, many people disagree with. And, if you go on the blogs after you've spoken, there's all kinds of hatred, and many of it will be about, the Jew, the this, the that. Do you ever wonder, well, maybe, it could cause some type of a backlash towards Judaism, the fact that I'm taking some type of a conservative position that 50% of the country will disagree with?
Not particularly. I mean, again, I think that the only representatives of Jews supposedly have been liberal Jews in public for a very long time, and those people are not representing anything remotely resembling a Judaic viewpoint. It's just that people identify them as Jews by their last names, or because they'll say sometimes that they're Jewish and that they go to Yom Kippur before breaking for lunch. So if I have the choice between being a representative of what I think is a more authentic brand of Judaism, or letting other people who are completely disconnected from any authenticity in Judaism speak publicly about Jewish principles, I would much rather it be me. Now, that doesn't mean I'm the best advocate for everything that's out there, right? Again, when people ask me halakhic questions, I almost always defer to a rabbi because they know the answers better than I do. But when it comes to deep-seated moral questions, I don't think that you need to be a rabbi to understand basic Jewish principle, which is why the vast majority of Jews are not rabbis. So, but I've never thought that anti-Semites need an excuse to be anti-Semitic. Anti-Semites attribute communism to the Jews. They attribute capitalism to the Jews. They attribute nationalism to the Jews. They attribute internationalism to the Jews. They attribute parochialism to the Jews. They attribute perversion to the Jews. So they don't need an excuse from me to be anti-Semitic. All that I can hope is that if people are going to hate Jews, at least they should hate us for the right reasons, because we're saying things that are important.
Okay. I could see why you graduated summa cum laude, Okay, Orthodox Jews in particular are infatuated with Trump. And look, you're a parent, right? And you have the sense to understand, look, the man's character may be somewhat questionable, to be polite, whereas his actions as a president, on the other hand, in many ways are far superior than the presidents that preceded him. But many teenagers or people just who don't have cutting intellect don't make that differentiation, and they've put Trump on a pedestal. And in effect, we're putting somebody who's, an adulterer, a thief, etc. I think all 10 commandments, we could safely assume, if not 10, maybe 8 of them, he's trampled on with relish. Do you worry that putting, historically, presidents have been seen also as moral figures? Maybe even Kennedy, while he was alive, maybe is the exception. But certainly George W., I had dinner with him a beautiful person, this type of person you could see, you would introduce to a young woman and say, I have a fabulous boy for you, either one of the Bushes, etc. Do you see having a president who many people would agree is morally, I don't want to use any word. Compromise, thank you. And putting him on a pedestal, do you see that as, now a teenager and says, well, the president of the United States, who is the most powerful man, the most quoted man, he's in the paper every single day, he's in news all day, and he also did what? So does that make that, and therefore, in effect, sort of undermine the character, both as Jews and as human beings?
I mean, yes, putting anybody on a pedestal who does not deserve to be on a pedestal is a serious problem. And I think that this has been a real generational divide for a lot of people, both Jews and non-Jews. What you see is that older Jews tend to put him on a pedestal because he's doing a lot of good things, and they see politics as transactional, and so they're not seeing him as much as like a moral voice, and they're not expecting him to. So they're just looking at all the stuff he's done, and they're saying a lot of this is great. And then you're seeing younger Jews and younger people generally, and they're saying, well, I thought the president was supposed to be a moral person. I was always told growing up that the president was supposed to be a moral person, and this president is not a character of moral fabric. So what exactly are you guys going on about? And because people lack cognitive dissonance, it's very difficult for a lot of people to say, I like a lot of what he's doing, but personally he's sort of a schmuck, right? Like, it's very difficult for people to make that mental distinction. And because of that, that has created a fair bit of tension, I think, even in Orthodox circles between younger people and older people. Now, again, I think that the solution to a lot of this is to recognize there are two things we can do. One, we can tell the truth about what's happening. As you say, you can like a lot of what the president's doing. I just went to the Hanukkah party at the White House. I like a lot of what the president's doing. I'm very friendly with a lot of members of his administration. And also, the man has a serious lack of moral character. I mean, this is just, these two things can simultaneously exist. That's okay. It's not okay in the sense that we're like happy with it, but let's not pretend that something is not happening when it's happening. The second thing that we can do is we can recognize that, in general, we should actually not be looking to presidents for moral character. We can talk about, looking to our presidents for moral character, but here's the reality of the situation in terms of moral character. You're right. I think George W. Bush was a moral man. Bill Clinton was a deeply immoral man. Barack Obama, on a personal level with his family, was a moral guy who was deeply immoral in politics. Donald Trump does a lot of stuff I like, not a man of morality. Maybe you could say that Reagan and H.W. were men of moral character, but you can't really say that about Richard Nixon. You can't really say that about LBJ. You can't really say that about JFK. So we've had a lot of presidents with very checkered histories with regard to morality. It's just that Trump is a lot more open about exactly where he differs from traditional morality where he sins and all the rest. I think that we've made an error in parenting if we think that we are supposed to direct our children to look to the President of the United States as a moral figure. We should be able to pick, not based on the office, but based on the person, who we want our children to emulate. I would never tell my kids, the President is always someone you should emulate. Why? A lot of people occupy that office. I would tell my kids, emulate my father, emulate your rabbi, emulate your mom, emulate, a bunch of great people who are around you, and that'll set you on a better path for life. It's pretty rare that you have a person in public life who you think, okay, that's a person that I definitely want my kids to emulate.
Yeah. I'll tell you an interesting biblical reference to this. It says King Saul made one mistake with Amalek, and he lost his kingship. And King David made multiple mistakes with women, and he didn't. So the Malbim, who was a commentator who lived around 300 years ago, 400 years ago, he said, well, one was a political mistake, an actionable military mistake that he made, which the entire country suffered because of with Amalek. So therefore, he lost his kingship. What David did in his private life did not affect the people, and therefore he did not lose his status as king, notwithstanding the error that he made. So we see already the biblical divide between something that you do in your personal life and something that is in your public life. As sort of, I don't want to compare Chas v'Shalom these people to what's going on now, but this concept that you mentioned as a biblical. Now, what about Trump?
Yeah, and I would add one thing to that analysis, and that is that while I agree with the analysis, and I've heard it spoken by a lot of folks, the question is, what is our role in as people who are watching this and bringing up kids in this world? God gets to decide whether Shaul stays king or whether he doesn't, and God gets to decide whether David stays king or whether he doesn't. But it is our job to be both Shmuel and Natan, meaning that it's our job to actually call things as we see them, and then God decides what happens after that. Okay.
So the takeaway is that we look at the president as a chief executive officer and not as some type of a moral demagogue to aspire to.
Right, and also it is incumbent on us that when the president sins personally or publicly, that it is our job to call that out, just as we would with anybody else. And hiding it for the purposes of trying to cover for that person is rarely either a politically winning strategy or a morally useful strategy. Like, I find that when I talk to young people, if I were to say to young people, President Trump, great guy, terrific leader, moral character, just moral on every level, young people would laugh, and they'd be right to laugh. But if I say to them, and this is as somebody who's likely to vote for President Trump in 2020, if I say to them, President Trump's done a lot of stuff that I like, I think he has a lot of moral flaws, a lot of them, and I disagree with a lot of his behavior. Younger people are more likely to take my argument seriously in favor of his benefits if I'm honest about his flaws.
So as an honest person then, would you, if you had a Democrat running who you thought was, had the correct political positions, was of the correct character, et cetera, maybe a Michael Bloomberg, could you see yourself voting for a Democrat?
I wouldn't vote for Bloomberg, but if there were a Democrat who fulfilled more boxes politically for me than President Trump and were of higher moral character, sure. I don't think the party labels matter nearly as much as the policies, and you have to weigh those things in the balance, every time. But I think the likelihood of the Democrats running anybody who would even be mildly palatable to me is virtually zero. They've moved in a radical direction.
Yeah, I'm just using it as a metaphor. In other words, many people, they're Democrats, every Republican is bad. Many Republicans, every Democrat is bad. And I think a more nuanced position is, look, there's no bad, there's no good. Let's look at the person, his position, his character, et cetera, and let's decide who his opponents and who is the more appropriate leader, rather than I'm blue or I'm red. That's what my takeaway is from what you said.
Oh, yeah. For me, the part, all that matters to me is the principle. The parties are just vehicles for preservation of the principle. If the parties aren't preserving that principle, then I leave the party.
So here's this. Trump has been embraced by the Jews of this country, certainly the Orthodox Jews. The Reform, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, the Reform, yeah, exactly.
Yes.
That's right.
But the Orthodox embrace him, and Israel has embraced him. I think the Times recently had an article that said 3 countries we're closer to because of Trump. One of them is Israel, and he's a demigod over there. In fact, the ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, who represented me for many years, is a demigod in Israel because he's Trump's, emissary. Are we being a little short-sighted? Because this presidents come and presidents go. We've so aligned ourselves with Trump and the Republican Party that when they go, could they do to Israel and to us the same thing what, in effect, Trump has done to Obama, which is basically eviscerate practically everything he's put into place with this? He's left some remnants of the health care bill. But can the blowback, the swing of the pendulum be just as mighty as with as much energy as it's gone to the right, go back to the left? And then are we making a mistake by embracing him so wholeheartedly?
Well, I think that, again, politics is reactionary in this moment. And I think that the reason people are embracing Trump so wholeheartedly is because Obama was wildly anti-Israel to the point of anti-Semitism. I mean, the Obama administration embraced a deal with a murderous anti-Jewish regime and celebrated that deal and castigated anyone who disagreed with that deal, and then tried to deprive Israel of the means to defend itself in the middle of a war with Hamas. So the fact that Trump is very pro-Israel, why wouldn't people resonate to that? I mean, I certainly see why people resonate, and I don't see it as, well, now look at all these Jews who are resonating to Trump. That's going to cause the left to move in an anti-Israel direction. I was there in 2012 at the Democratic National Convention when the Democrats booed God in Jerusalem in the DNC platform. So they've been moving in this direction a lot longer than Trump has been on the political scene. To try and blame the Democrat move to the left on Israel on Trump is, I think, really short-sighted. Now, the one area where Trump needs to do better and where his success is tied to the state of Israel is if he continues to make himself unpopular and more Democrats get elected, and those Democrats are more radical because they're reacting to Trump, that's bad, right? So you're seeing that with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Rashid Tlaib and Keith Ellison and Ilhan Omar and this group of new Democrats have decided that it's perfectly fine to be openly anti-Semitic, right? That is not the fault of Trump, but it's the fault of a Trump backlash that is a response to the president, not on Israel, but on ancillary issues. As far as whether Israelis' love for Trump or Jews' love for Trump broadly in the Orthodox community or in the pro-Israel community is going to create a democratic backlash, that's the fault. I'm sorry, that's the fault of Democrats. That's not the fault of the people who like Israel and are happy to stand up for a politician who likes Israel too. If the Democrats want to get on the good side of people who like Israel, they could do something very easy, which is they could stop being wildly anti-Israel for 5 seconds.
Yeah, but when Netanyahu comes and to be embraced this way by the Republicans, it doesn't pay to be so one-sided, recognizing that one side is not going to be in power.
But again, I mean, Netanyahu was actively castigated by Barack Obama during the entirety of the administration, even though Netanyahu publicly was having his defense minister talk about how warm the relationship was with the Democrats. If there were a Democrat in office today, Netanyahu would be trying to work with that person to the best of his ability because Netanyahu is a survivor and he's smart enough to know that a close relationship with the United States is still important. He tried to do that with Obama. It failed. That wasn't because of Netanyahu. It's because Obama is radically anti-Israel. And the same thing is true when it comes to President Trump.
You say Obama was radically anti-Israel. Look, his chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, served in the Israeli army. That's a first. We may never have that again, right? His chief of staff, his organization was staffed with Jews. To say he was violently anti-Israel, what do you base? And even to deal with Iran, and clearly, look, I'm Orthodox and I'm pro-Israel, and I have a daughter who have children and grandchildren in Israel. But my point is that when somebody takes the position that it's better to appease Iran, wrongfully or rightfully, certainly doesn't make them anti-Israel.
It makes you anti-Israel when you are embracing a lie that the regime has moderated, specifically in order to create a deal that turns Iran into more of a regional power so that they can fund terrorism. You ignore all of the negative effects of your deal, including the green lighting of a long-range missile program. And then you proceed to try to cut off aid to Israel in the middle of the Gaza war in 2014. As far as Rahm Emanuel...
Go back. Are you suggesting that Obama wanted more terrorism in the world? Wanted Iranians to have long-term missiles? Is Obama like some Soviet plant?
No. I'm suggesting that Barack Obama did not care as much about the safety and security of the future of Israel as of creating what he saw as a regional power balance that reduced Israel in the region, reduced Saudi Arabia in the region, and upheld Iran as a center in the balance of power.
Yeah, but
so he was willing to ignore a bunch of...
But isn't that balance of power because he felt for world peace, a balance of... Look, when we invaded Iraq, everybody thought it's the most brilliant thing, wiping it. It hasn't proved to be such a brilliant thing. I mean, it's very nuanced. What peace in the Middle East
fine. That's fine. That's to change your topic, but that's fine. But
I don't mean,
that
but I mean to say it's very nuanced. A balance of power could be good for Israel. You could understand somebody.
A balanced power with Iran is not good for Israel. There is no balance of power with Iran.
But could you?
And Obama actively had his national security advisor Ben Rhodes lie to the American people about the Iran deal in order to sell it, and he had his allies lie about Republicans in order to sell it.
But Ben, can't you see Obama believing that, as many believe, that a deal with Iran stabilized the region, and stabilization of the region is good for Israel? Now, you could disagree with his logic and whatever his command is and whatever you're telling him, but to take the next step and say, since he believed that, it's anti-Semitism, I'm not connecting those dots.
I'm not saying that I'm not saying that the Iran deal is inherently anti-Semitism. I'm saying that if you enable your entire administration to lie about the Iran deal and to target opponents of the Iran deal as wanting war, and to suggest that there are no downsides to the...
That could be bad politics, but it's not anti-Semitic.
The anti-Semitic part of the anti-Semitic elements of the Obama administration is in the middle of the 2014 war, when they actively decide to deprive Israel of its means for self-defense in order to pressure Israel to make a deal with the terrorist group. That's anti-Semitic.
Yeah, that could be.
Okay, and again, the fact is that while they later denied the story, the fact is that early on in the Obama administration, there were very credible reports that were differentially reported about Rahm Emanuel approaching Jews in a Jewish context, telling them that if they did not start making concessions to the Palestinians, then he would be pushing the Iran deal. I remember that he denied it later.
Is Rahm Emanuel anti-Semitic then?
No, Rahm Emanuel is a politically left hack who is willing to do what... This is why I say that leftist anti-Semitism merges with generalized leftism, with mainstream leftism in policy, if not in intent. So I don't know that Barack Obama is in intent an anti-Semite, although I don't know how you sit in Jeremiah Wright's church for 20 years hearing slanders about Jews and get away with it. And that's an unbelievable thing to me.
But you wouldn't say Rahm Emanuel is anti-Semitic, right?
No, I wouldn't say Rahm Emanuel is anti-Semitic. I'd say that Rahm Emanuel is a sucker.
So I'm saying at the very least what we could have is misguided people. But I think there's a stretch between misguided people and anti-Semitism.
Right, and what I've said is that the Obama administration's activities were in effect anti-Semitic, which they were in 2014.
Even though it may have been well-intentioned.
Right. Well, again, this is where I think that the ADL and so many folks on the left begin to lose the thread, is the suggestion that well-intentioned people who then pursue policies that end with the death of more Jews are preferable to people who are badly intentioned and are ineffective. Like, badly intentioned and ineffective is less of a threat to the Jews worldwide than people who are well-intentioned on the left, who are willing to make common cause with the Iranians.
Ben, I agree with everything you're saying, but what I don't connecting the dots is I'm saying if I were the leader of the world and I said, stabilizing the Middle East is the most important thing, and yes, everybody in the neighborhood is a beneficiary. I could be wrong. When I believe that Rahm Emanuel says, making concessions to the Palestinians is good for the state of Israel, which many people, including many Israeli leaders, have believed. Now, I may disagree with them, but it certainly doesn't make them anti-Semitic. At the very worst, it says, look, they're inept leaders and therefore will cause to the bloodshed. But I'm just not connecting the dots to anti-Semitism.
Well, again, I think that I'm not saying Rahm Emanuel is an anti-Semite. I have my doubts about Barack Obama and his general take on the Jewish people. Again, after you sit in Jeremiah Wright's church for 20 years, I don't know a Republican politician on planet Earth who would be able to sit in a church for 20 years in which Judaism was derided in the way that Jeremiah Wright derided Judaism and get away with it. It just would not happen. It's an insane thing.
But Ben, that's also a jump, because we know that he has, in his 20 years, there were a few statements that he made, but we also know that Obama, notwithstanding his moral character, did not go to church very often. There's a very good likelihood that the occasions he went to church were not the times that Jeremiah Wright said those things.
He called Jeremiah Wright I don't want to rehash the entire Obama administration.
But
he called Jeremiah Wright his moral mentor. He did a fundraiser with Rashid Khalidi.
I don't know. I'm just saying, how many
Rashid Khalidi was the spokesman for the Palestinian Authority, for the Palestine Liberation Organization, when it was a terrorist group, right? The LA Times did the tape. This is back in 2008. Like, Barack Obama does not have a good record with the Jews. But again, this is less important to me than the reason this conversation started was the idea that if Bibi Netanyahu or other Jews were nicer to the Democrats, then Israel would be more of a bipartisan issue. And my answer to that is that I think Israel would be more of a bipartisan issue if Democrats were nicer to Israel. I do not think that it is the responsibility of Jews to wine and dine people to not sign on to terrible deals with nuclear-armed powers that shout death to Israel. I think it is the responsibility of moral people not to sign on to those deals in the first place. And then it seems to me that the Jews, particularly, the Jews who are pro-Israel, have not changed their stripes here. It's just that the parties have shifted around them. And by the way, this is what the polls show. What the polls show is that the Democratic Party base has been moving consistently anti-Israel since 2001. This is not a late move. This is not something that happened since Trump. It's not something that happened since Obama. It exacerbated from 2008 on. But there's been a separation between the Republican feelings about Israel and the Democratic feelings about Israel dating back mainly to 9/11 when there was, nearly even support. It was still heavier Republican than Democrat, but at least a majority of Democrats still supported Israel. That began to part around 9/11 when the Democrats began to embrace a different model of thinking about foreign policy in which Israel was the key to the entire Middle Eastern crisis. And there was this attempt to understand terrorism by blaming Israel's presence for the spread of Islamic terrorism more broadly.
Ben, you lecture at a lot of, you speak at a lot of campuses, etc., which the vast majority of, education, higher education in the United States is very left, quite anti-Israel. As an Orthodox Jew, do you fear for your grandchildren here in this country? Do you say, I don't see this ending well or not?
Well, I certainly fear that the intersectional politics that are being pushed on college campuses are very bad for Jews. And as that becomes more and more exacerbated, I have fears, not just for Jews, but for the country as a whole. I think that as the Jews go, to the extent that they are a successful minority group in the United States, the possibility of the country falling apart as well grows higher, because the Jews are always a canary in the coal mine for this sort of stuff. And the fact that what you're seeing from the intersectional left is a forcible expulsion of anti-Semitism from the list of hatreds that are unacceptable, that's a very scary thing. I mean, when you see the intersectional left basically hail Linda Sarsour at the same time Linda Sarsour is hailing Louis Farrakhan, that's a real problem. I do think there's a backlash beginning. I think people are tired of this. I think people are tired of being divided by group identity. And I think that there will be a backlash, but I think that we're going to have to be beyond the Trump administration for that to happen. I think that we're probably 12 to 15 years away from a serious backlash to the radical left push that's being made in the country right now. I think the radical left has been identified with the anti-Trump left, and that may be strong enough to return them to power, but I think there will be a backlash to the backlash.
Well, Ben, thank you very much for your time.
Hey, thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
We have on the line Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir is originally from the United States, currently living in Efrat. He is formerly the research director of the Business Ethics Center in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem, which dealt, of course, with Jewish business ethics. He's also the author of The Jewish Ethicist, which is a book and also a column on Torah, and he's currently the director of the Economic Division in Kohelet Forum, also in Jerusalem, Israel. Rabbi Meir, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you very much for inviting you, and welcome and to all the listeners.
Thank you very much. And perhaps starting with a general question. We had on the show earlier on today, we had Ben Shapiro. Ben Shapiro, of course, is a well-known conservative pundit and blogger and a public intellectual of note. And he spoke about the kind of new anti-Semitism that we're facing today, which is to some degree from the alt-right, as we know, but to a larger degree, he certainly believed from new quarters, from the left-wing quarters, together with from the radical Islamic quarters. And the question is, from a Jewish or a rabbinic perspective, how do we see this? Is this really a new phenomenon? Is it something different to what there used to be in the past? Or is it just more of the same? It's halacha hi, Esav Sones Yaakov, and Esav, in this respect, can take on many different forms and many different personas and manifestations, and it's really all the same. How should we perceive or understand this?
I want to just start out that the terminology is very delicate. There's so many different kinds of ways that one group of people can dislike or hate another group of people, and especially since today the bar has become so low that anyone time who dares to suggest that one nation or one group of people could in any way be different than the other, or they're automatically accused of racism, or if it happens to be with Jews, automatically accused of anti-Semitism. I think it's useful to distinguish between a few different kinds of categories, and then I'm going to get rid of those categories and then tell you what I think really is anti-Semitism. Okay, what I don't think is anti-Semitism is that people, they know Jews, they're familiar with them, they recognize that, as we indeed do, that Jews have certain things that are distinguished from non-Jews. And some of those things they like, and some they may not like. There was a case a few years ago where somebody discovered that President Harry Truman, who had a very good relationship with Jews, he called Jews pushy. And someone described that as an anti-Semitic statement. So, we can categorize things the way we like. I wouldn't call that anti-Semitism. He knew Jews. I may also think that Jews can sometimes be pushy. It may be, I might like it or I might not like it, but at any rate, it's some particular characteristic that someone identifies with Jews that he may have a problem with, and that I certainly don't call anti-Semitism.
Okay. No, there's a big gulf between President Truman and between statements
but I'm
of
saying
people like Louis Farrakhan and others in the modern age that are accepted figures and public figures who seem to be very clearly anti-Semitic.
Right. No, I really feel obligated to do this only because the bar has become so low. A few years ago, I wouldn't have any need to do that because everybody recognized that saying that Jews are pushy is not an anti-Semitic statement or per se an anti-Semitic statement, and yet the bar has become so low that I just take a few minutes to distinguish between some things that people may not like Jews or something about Jews that I'm not going to talk about that. I'm not going to call that anti-Semitism, whether it's the new or the old kind. Another thing is bigotry.
You mean if an Englishman would say that Americans are rude, it doesn't make him into an anti-American. You're just saying,
right,
okay.
or it may be right. That's exactly the point, right? People have certain and that they have. People have different characteristics. We're proud of the fact that we're distinguished in other ways, and some people may like that more or less. So those kind of things I'm not going, this is really a semantic thing. I wouldn't call that anti-Semitism. Another thing that I prefer not to call anti-Semitism because it just confuses the issue is something called bigotry. In the 1970s, we had a figure on American television named Archie Bunker. And Archie Bunker believed that the Jews were crafty and that Polish people were stupid, and he believed that black people were lazy, and he had all kinds of things. Was he a racist, an anti-Semite? You could call him all those things, but really what he was what he was commonly called was a bigot. He had just a lot of preconceptions of a lot of people without making it into some kind of gigantic ideology. And that also, he didn't have any special animus towards any one of those, ethnic or religious groups. And so that also, it's not going to be useful to try and understand what's unique about the Jews if we're going to talk about an Archie Bunker kind of bigotry.
All right, meaning a guy that speaks against many different groups will make him a general bigot, not an anti-Semite.
Yeah, we'll call him a bigot.
So let's put that on the side. Let's talk about the real anti-Semite.
We can love or hate bigotry, but it's not a Jewish issue.
Fair enough.
And then I'm going to go to something that then you have something that's very problematic. You have people who are anti-landlord. It may be that market conditions in my area mean that apartments are very expensive and not very good, and that if anyone who doesn't pay the rent or take care of the apartment is going to get evicted because that's the way life is. And it happens to be that in my neighborhood, the landlords are Hasidic Jews, and so my anti-landlord sentiment is expressed in anti-Jewish sentiment. This is already bordering on anti-Semitism because I'm identifying a particular problem that I have with a particular individual with a broader thing. And at the same time, it's not connected with any per se animus towards Jews. It's something that a person is actually experiencing, and he's projecting on Jews. There is an element of anti-Semitism in that. I think it has to be fought. And I think the bigger issue of anti-Semitism is when people think that something very unique about the Jews, something unique and dangerous, and usually it's cosmic, and this is the classic thing was.
But we also think that there's something unique about the Jews.
Right.
That's a very deeply Jewish belief. So, is there a problem with non-Jews sharing our own belief that we're unique?
So this is a question that it comes when it becomes something that's substantive, or when it goes over into something that's evil. If people say the Jews are Christ killers, that's anti-Semitism. Someone thinks there's something in the essence of the Jewish substance, Jewish nationhood that's evil, that's foreign, that needs to be fought. I'm not qualified to just to go into the theological discussion of that. But someone who acts against Jews in any private or public way because of the idea that there's cosmic sin that they're guilty of, that's true anti-Semitism. And somebody who connects Jews with capitalism, I think that part of the issue of some of the, unfortunately, I'm not a big expert on anti-Semitism. The truth is, I never experienced anti-Semitism in America. I barely experienced bigotry even. I met some people who were anti-Semites who were very, considered people, and they told me about their anti-Semitism. I never experienced it as something that I had to fight, that limited me in any way. And so I may be, the wrong person to have this conversation. But when I look at when you look
at today, you don't have to be a great expert to see the anti-Semitism that's going on from radical Islam in Europe and even in the United States. And returning to the original question, is this just a continuation of the classic anti-Semitism of attributing these cosmic, if you want, or inherent negative traits to Jews, or is there something new going on here? We know Chazal tell us, Chazal definitely had this approach. Chazal tell us, V'lama nikra shmo Sinai sheyado sitna le'olam, right, that with the Torah came an inherent hatred of the Jewish people. So is this just
I never understood
the same thing?
That way, Rabbi Pfeffer. You know what? I always understood that maybe I just never looked at the Rishonim. I understand that there was a sina to the Umot Olam to the extent that they rejected the Torah. You know what? This could be an interesting discussion in and of itself, and it could be that I never examined the question, but I never understood the Midrash in that way. That the
Shemisham Yada Sina LeYisrael, hate to Yisrael. I think if I'm not mistaken, the Lashon is
interesting.
Sina LeYisrael. But anyway, we know, right? Esav Sina LeYaakov, Halacha he.
And then that exact same midrash says the Afal Pichen Tozman Yishakol B'Kol Libo. It's not even that we find somewhere else that one place we find that Esav hates Yaakov, another place we find that he loved him. But that exact same statement of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says that even though halacha that's the usual halacha, and yet at that moment we see that he really did feel that brotherhood towards him. So I'm just not really sure to what extent Chazal teach us that there's essentially a hatred of Jews among non-Jews. We see the Torah talks about the great admiration. There's midrashim that you mentioned, the Sina Yisrael, however you want to understand that, the Sina Matolam, but we see the Torah itself talks about the great admiration that the non-Jews have to the Torah and to the Jews who keep the Torah. I'm just
let's
make
take
a statement that Chazal just assumed that it's a part of nature that the non-Jews hate the Jews, and that's not certainly, like I say, the Torah we see. On the contrary, that the Torah says that we're going to be admired for our adherence to the Torah And we find in many places in also in Tanakh, we see that Paro is so excited when he hears that Yosef's brothers are coming. He's so enamored of Joseph and his ability and his loyalty and so on that he wants to have more Jews in his kingdom, and he invites them. He sends the Agalot. I think that's also a very common theme. It
was perhaps self-interest to some degree. He believed that they would be able to promote his own interest. But let me go to. So I understand. Let me take that to the American experience. I mean, we know that many of the Gedolei Torah refer to America as a Malchus Shel Chesed, as a very unique place. Meaning, if you need proof that Jews were not universally hated, so perhaps the United States over centuries and certainly over many decades could be adduced, could be mentioned as proof of that, while at the same time we do find even today and perhaps specifically today certain aspects or certain trends that point towards a future that's less clear than it was before. Anti-Semitism rearing its head in a number of different manifestations, of course, throughout Europe, which is in itself a great shock for many Jews who had previously felt comfortable, and even in the United States. And how do you understand this development or these developments in Europe and even in the United States? Where's this taking us? How do we look at this?
Okay, so let me just think. I think what's going on in Europe, again, I'm at such a remove, but I think a lot of what's going on in Europe is just a transformation of the old thing. If our old if our old religion was Christianity, and then the Jews had to play the role of the villain, so the Jews were the enemies of Christ, and if today the Satan is capitalism, then there's like a reflexive among certain European anti-Semites. I think what I see going on,
if the devil is nationalism, and then Israel, of course, is the representative.
Okay, I like to think about that a little bit, but let's just talk about. I think that part of the current European anti-Semitism is just the same old anti-Semitism. You have nationalists in certain parts of Europe who view the Jews as strangers and enemies, and they want to get them out, or they want to blame them for all the ills of their country. And we don't even have to look at it as an old anti-Semitism, which is wearing new garments. It's just merely the same old anti-Semitism that people are familiar with.
Okay, and then let's go to the United States then.
This is one thing.
Europe is more of the same.
We also have in Europe a situation where it's the same old idea, but it's just wearing the new garments of the new religion, right, the new Satan, and the Jews are still playing the same role. And I don't think it's nearly as virulent as it once was. I don't know if it's the same kind of danger, but in terms of the ideological basis, I think I view it as something very similar. In America, America is a unique case, as you pointed out, because America, the Jews are truly equal. America is not a nation state. It's not the Jews cannot be viewed as from the American point of view, as guests in somebody else's country. Right? The American was always a national. It was a project. It wasn't a race. It wasn't a religion. It was always a project. It was a concept. The idea of people who were born in America being automatically citizens have been discussed lately as a part of an expression of this. It really doesn't matter who you are. If you're part of the project, then you're equal. And well, I mean,
90-something% of the at the turn of the century, meaning at the turn of the 19th century, 90-some% of Americans were, Protestants. It was a very homogenic place to be living. I think Catholics for a time were persecuted. Of course, not like they were in Europe. But the fact that it's not a nation state doesn't mean it's immune to the anti-Semitic tendencies and feelings.
It's not, but I think there's a great importance to the fact that on the basic that that as a I don't know how deeply you get into this. Basically, there was a great resistance to Catholic immigrants. I don't think that, again, I'm not the world's biggest expert in this. The anti-Catholic feelings. You know what? We have enough Catholics in America now. We don't need to be flooded by immigrants from Ireland or from Italy. And I don't think it was so much, saying, well, those Catholics, American Catholics, we have to restrict their rights, we have to restrict their freedoms. It was, we want to impact the national character of people who we want to see who's going to join our project. I really view something very inherent in the United States in terms of the freedom of religion, the Constitution, which guarantees, that there's not going to be an establishment of religion, as something very fundamental, as saying that anybody who's part of our project, either because they're born here, because they're nationalized, for however they got here, they really are in some very fundamental way equal citizens. That was not true, of course, for the blacks for many years, but once that's definitely become accepted now. That basically all Americans are part of this project, and they all have equal rights and equal representation and so on. And so I think it's something that's really unique, because in Europe you have a lot of states which are nation states, and then the question can be asked: Are Jews Germans? Are they Swedes or not? And that's an interesting question. And then you have to ask the question because there's some kind of national identity that's becoming involved. Or in France, where there's a very important concept to forge a French identity, which is mainly not based on your religion or on your race, but you're expected to buy into this French identity. And in America, I think all those things are absent. And I really feel that Jews in America are equal.
And yet we see today, I can tell you I don't visit America particularly often, but I was on a recent visit to America. I went on the New York subway, and I was, exposed to very unpleasant anti-Semitic slurs, get out of Palestine, and I have to say, it was just, one guy, and the rest of the people sitting around me also felt deeply uncomfortable. But I don't think that's like an isolated incident. Meaning, there's definitely anti-Semitic incidents on the rise in the United States. How do you trigger that?
I view this as an isolated thing. Is it widespread or not widespread? So we can discuss it. It's not something that's part of the American identity, in the sense that anti-Semitism was part of the identity of certain places in Europe. There's people in America who have negative feelings towards people of different colors, of different religions, of different orientations. There's a huge polarization in America, a really unprecedented polarization between Democrats and Republicans, which we never had, when I was in America. And some of that is going to be is directed against Jews. And
you mean because Jews are either seen as being democratic, or they're seen as being capitalist, or they're representing?
In Europe, it was not the same that somebody who had anti-Jewish feeling and somebody who had some kind of other nationalism. In America, black people can experience anti-racist rants. Some of these things make their way to Twitter. And some people there's all kinds of people who experience rants from people who are Americans and hate them for whatever reason they are. And I have to speak carefully because I don't visit America so often, and I have fortunately always had very good experiences. But what I feel is that in America, that whatever animus what have I experienced is that Jews are one more group that some people like and some people dislike, and sometimes they're going to be the subject of a anti-Semitic rant, like every so often a black person may be subject to a racist rant, and Muslims are subject. We know that we've seen cases where Muslims are suddenly subject to some kind of crazy anti-Muslim rant, and so I don't think it's something, that's something I'd be even reluctant to call anti-Semitism as a broad phenomenon. It's a particular manifestation of the fact that a lot of people in America just have their pet peeves, and it can be, of course, very severe. I'm not, we as you point out, there were the
Pittsburgh event recently.
Pittsburgh event,
and
yet
an
we
example.
see that unfortunately America has mass shootings of different kinds, at various times, and it's not, one time in school, it's quite awful. I don't want to certainly not going to make light of it. One time is school children, one time is concert goers, and one time it's in a synagogue. And I haven't, at least to be the most careful, I haven't really seen any evidence of something unique about anti-Jewish animus, which is not just another manifestation of the fact there's a lot of crazy people in America who bear animus towards different groups, and sometimes the Jews are on the receiving end of that, and
okay.
So
again,
that's how I view it. Yeah.
But let me ask you to put the rabbinic hat on and give me an appraisal from a Jewish or traditional rabbinic perspective. This is a good thing. I mean, this sounds like a good thing. Does it have also its downside? How are we going to rephrase or look at this from a historical and rabbinic or traditional perspective? How do we see this?
Well, there's no question that it is praiseworthy that America has given Jews equal rights and equal opportunities. We know the Chazal tell us that the non-Jewish nations took an oath to not mistreat the Jews who were sitting among them, and
not mistreat them too much.
Yeah, well, that's part of the oath, but I think that it's even more praiseworthy if they don't mistreat them at all, and that if they really welcome them as equals, as America as an establishment has done since its founding, right? Like you can point different instances where this place or that place has had bad feelings, but as America as an establishment has welcomed Jews from its founding and from before its founding. And acknowledge them as equals among, of course, other nations as well. It's incumbent on the Jews to keep an awareness of their difference, of the fact that they're a unique nation, of the fact that this is whatever you view of the Geula status of the state of Israel now, and one way or the other, Jews have to acknowledge that they're the normal, natural state of the Jewish people is a Geula state, a state of redemption, a state of having a Jewish kingdom in the land of Israel. In this coming week's parsha, in Vayech, we have the Kli Yakar, who says, there was a great danger that he says. Right, they really feel right at home. So it's from the Jews' point of view, it's our responsibility to not feel too much at home, but it's very praiseworthy for the non-Jews to make us feel at home, and we see that also from our parsha where Yosef, the parsha that we're going to read this week, says that Yosef, he moved the people after he took the land from one city to another. And he says, I don't want the Jews people were going to call the Jews they're golim. They're exiled. They're displaced people. They're DPs. We're the real people, and the Jews are DPs. And Yosef felt as the viceroy of Egypt that was a a bad situation. It was good that from the establishment point of view, the establishment is welcoming. The establishment creates equality. Even in this case, there was a kind of affirmative action. And so I think that's, the message that we have from our Parsha. Yosef does two things, right? On the one hand, he says, tell Paro that you're herders. They hate herders. You're going to stay in the land of Goshen. You guys are going to create the conditions that is going to keep you as separate people and distinct, and people who are not going to mingle in Egyptian society. It's better if you're not going to be, ministers in Paro's government as I am. But at the same time, that same Yosef is also taking far-reaching steps to ensure that really the Jews have the opportunity to be equal. They have the opportunity to feel at home, to feel the same as other people, not to be considered as aliens or as displaced persons. And so, I really do feel that America is a place that has, the United States at least, is specifically a place that institutionally in its DNA, it's something that creates equality. And I think we can learn also from the story of our Parsha of Yosef, and also from the oaths of the non-Jewish nations that the Chazal tell us about, that's appropriate and praiseworthy for the non-Jews to try and make the Jews feel comfortable, to make them feel at home, to make them feel equal. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, we equally learn from our Parsha that from our point of view, we're supposed to be taking steps to make ourselves distinguished, to remember that this is a temporary abode, and it's an artificial existence on the way to a Geula existence. And we have to hope that the more that we have that consciousness ourselves, the less we need the non-Jews to kind of remind us of that, and remind us of our differences and so on. And I think it's very
meaning in the famous, reported famous machlekes between the Balatanya and I think it was the Rabbi Meir, if I'm not mistaken, concerning who we should support, right? The Tsar or Napoleon. Napoleon that's giving equal rights to the Jews, and the Tsar who isn't giving equal rights, and the Balatanya famously supported the Tsar, and reportedly that was because he felt that equal rights would be to the detriment of the Jewish population and would cause them to assimilate and would cause them to lose their Jewish identity and so on. So you're on the side of the. Well, you're not going with the Balatanya on this one. You're with Napoleon.
I think that there's a critical point missing here. That in the under the Tsar system, the Jews had collective autonomy, which is of immense value. Okay, it was not a case where under one system the Jews were they were subject to the whims of the non-Jewish rulers, and they didn't have rights, and the others are subjected to the rulers, but they do have rights. The situation is, again, I hope that I'm not getting out of my depth, and someone can correct me if I am. The situation in Russia with the Jews had collective autonomy. The rabbis had authority. They had the Beit Din had authority. If you think of the situation in Bavel where you had a Reish Galuta, right? A Reish Galuta is a special right that Jews have to have autonomy and to run their own affairs, and this is a wonderful right.
It's to run their own affairs provided they have the favor of the king or of the local noble, and if they don't have that favor, then of course they're at his mercy. This is a non-ideal situation.
Well, I understand that there's pluses and minuses on both sides, but I think that the choice that I'm not exactly totally familiar with the two sides there. The choice there was one where the Jews had, as individuals, maybe had lesser rights, but as a community had greater rights because they had the right to have their own courts, they had the right to have their own leadership, they could have to some extent their own laws, right? They had a certain collective autonomy, which was of great value. And that's different than, and that, by the way, was also true in many Arab countries. In many Arab countries, the Jews were granted certain collective rights, which were of great value. And so I think it's an artificial comparison. If you're comparing, Jews that in any case are in a modern system where it's not really conceivable that any ethnic or religious or other group could have any real measure of proper authority, and then to compare, where they do or they don't have equal rights. That doesn't resound, resonate at all with me. That was the distinction.
Right. So this is I think this raises an interesting point, which goes together with something you were speaking about before. But clearly in Europe, and particularly in the places where there was the emancipation of Jews and the giving of granting of equal rights to the Jews. So this was clearly done on an individual level and not on a national or a collective level. In the French Revolution, for example, this was very prominent. One of the leaders of the French Revolution, the Count of Clermont-Tonnerre, he famously said that we should grant everything to the Jews as individuals, but we should grant them nothing as a nation, because either they're French or they're not. They can't be here as Jewish nationals.
And I'm sure that Balatanya was aware of that dichotomy and
aware and
role
right.
in his decision. And
right,
and
but it's interesting. Right, but I find it interesting that you feel that kind of tension by definition can't exist in America, and that's interesting. Meaning, there is sometimes a certain inherent tension, and I think we saw this sometimes with Netanyahu on his visits to America, where the question is, what should the first interests of the Jewish population of America be? Should it be America first, which is something that obviously President Trump is very much pushing, right? The whole concept of make America great again, America first, that's our basic interest. Or for a Jewish person, given his Jewish national identity and given that Israel is, whether we like it as being strongly Zionist or we're more reluctant about it, but the fact of the matter is that Israel is the national representation of the Jewish people in the geopolitical scene. So is it America first or is it Israel first? And wouldn't this be a fair evaluation and an actual tension even in America of today for a Jewish person?
I would say two things. Israel has been around for 70 years. I personally can't think of any situation in the last 70 years where there was a real fundamental, powerful, different conflict of interest between the interests of the United States and the Iran deal under President Obama. So
just as an example, and there might be others.
I don't agree with that at all. And again, I'm going to just repeat that I can just look back. I'm not 70 years old, but looking back at the events that I'm familiar with, I can't think of any case where a person could point to a salient conflict of interest between the interests of the United States and Israel, and certainly not a case where the Jews, were trying to promote some kind of action of the United States, qua the United States, that was to the detriment of the United States as they viewed it, and as many other people did that. I certainly not advocate, while Jews are there, as part of, the Jews have to be good citizens, they have to be good neighbors, they have to be loyal citizens, and I certainly wouldn't, recommend that they would put the interests of, as Americans, put the interests of the Jewish people, the Jewish state, ahead of the United States interest. But I don't see that's a dilemma that Jews face individually, or it could be that a Jew in one situation or another will face it. But I just don't see where this dichotomy comes from and where the dilemma comes from. And if a Jew really feels in America that he really feels he's obligated to do something for the benefit of Israel, which is to the detriment of America, then then maybe he should move or something. And I just can't just really think of cases where there were salient issues of that nature. I still don't agree that the Iran deal is one of them.
Meaning, so but what you're saying,
Americans were against the Iran deal for reasons of America's interest. Plenty of Israel advocates were for the Iran deal for cause of Israel's interest. I can't agree that that's a good example.
Okay, so what you're saying is that what it sounds like you're saying is that it's worked out well, meaning it didn't have to work out so well. It could have been that Israel and the United States would have been on deeply conflicting sides in terms of policy and in terms of geopolitics, but to our advantage, and perhaps through our siyata d'shmaya and the fact that so many Jews are living in America, it's just worked out very well. Meaning it's worked out that they are close allies and deep friends, and therefore this tension hasn't ever come up. Not that it couldn't come up.
Well, I think that's kind of a way of phrasing it. There's something very fundamental about the friendship between the United States and Israel, which is not just a coincidence. It's not just, it happens to be that we have the oil and they need the oil, and so it's and they have the army and we need the army. I don't think it's like that. It's like that at all. I don't think it's an expedient relationship that happens to have worked out very expediently. I think it's a very fundamental confluence of interests, which is and there's good reasons that the things that are in the interests of the United States, that are interests of Israel, the interests of certain ideals that both countries share, and certain interests that both countries share, have I can't say it's an exact confluence, but nothing that would put American Jews in the feeling that they're being disloyal by taking certain actions that are the benefit of their countrymen. And I just add that Americans that who belong to other ethnic and national groups have also felt that they have a unique perspective on some humanitarian need outside of the United States, and they have not been reluctant to lobby the United States to help their countrymen abroad. And this is part of the American discourse also. It's true that that Teddy Roosevelt, he was very against the hyphenated Americans. And yet the hyphenated Americans of all varieties have been an active part of the American discourse for a long time, and a legitimate part of it, as long as they're not, it's part of their vision of what America is supposed to be, as opposed to what their community identity is somehow, as opposed to the United States. So I would say also in relation to the Jews and also in relation to other groups in America that somehow view their ideal of America as they're including some kind of particular relationship to fledgling democracies or to humanitarian crises in other parts of the world, as something as a legitimate part of the political discourse and the community discourse in America. And I just don't see that creating an existential crisis for Jews anytime soon.
Rabbi Meir, thank you very much for being with us today. Instructive as always.
Okay, so thank you very much for having me, and I'm glad I had the chance to talk a little bit about events and a little bit about the Parshat HaShavua also, and some things that are temporary and some things that are really eternal. So I thank you very much.
All the very best, Cultus.
Let's go to the chosen winner of this week's riddle.
Hi, the answer to the question of why we say Yosef and Mitzvah Katan and Mitzvah like Kibbutz Avayim. The Ran says in Bava Metzia, if I recall correctly, that you don't say Yosef and Mitzvah only when you have two mitzvahs in front of you. You didn't start either one, and the other mitzvahs takes precedence over Kibbutz Avayim. If you already started Kibbutz Avayim, then you do say Yosef and Mitzvah in regard to any other mitzvah that comes up in between. And the Rabbi Yosef brings us around Allah here and there.